And let me begin by saying it's truly an honor to be here at the Rubin and playing a small part in this fantastic exhibit. I saw that some of you hadn't had a chance to see the exhibit yet, but I strongly recommend you to do so for no other reason than it kind of challenges the common perceptions of what Buddhism is. Of course, in the modern West, we think of Buddhism as peace and compassion and mindfulness. And this exhibit kind of reminds us that, as with many religions, Buddhism also comes with political ideology and also military violence and warfare. And that's kind of what I will be focusing on today, the civil war and conflicts that were kind of inaugurated by the famous meeting between Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of China, or the Yuan Dynasty, and Pakpa Lama, the leading Lama of the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. And in particularly, I mean, why this meeting is so important, I mean, again, it's not that political leaders and Buddhist teachers have not met through the course of time. This tradition goes all the way back to the Buddha himself. I mean, in the Buddhist scriptures, there's all of these stories of the Buddha meeting with kings and the kings giving him land and supporting the Sangha and giving money. And of course, this is the kind of the karmic ritual socioeconomic relationship that kind of defines the Buddhist community across Asia. So in one sense, this unification of religious and political authority is nothing new, but this particular meeting, which happened in the 1260s, was basically about to shape the history of East Asia, and particularly Inner Asia, for the particularly the 400 years that we're talking about today, but even all the way up to today. And I'd like to begin by pointing out, there's maybe 4 reasons why we should care about something that happened in the 13th century. And the first is quite simply that we may not really much know about Tibet if this meeting had never happened. In a certain sense, now, of course, Tibet is everywhere. The Dalai Lama is a world-famous guru who has won the Nobel Peace Prize, and there's the Free Tibet movement, and Richard Gere has talking about Tibet at the Oscars, and of course the Beastie Boys, were very big with the Free Tibet movement in the 80s and 90s. And so how did this happen, or why did this happen? In a certain sense, it was as a result of this meeting. Of course, the Mongols created the world's largest land empire in the history of the world. And so when you became connected with that military, political, and economic machine, you were obviously lifted up into the higher ranks of religious authority. And that was very much what happened in the case of Tibet. I mean, in a certain sense, as a historian, it's kind of dangerous to do the what-if kind of game or questions. But if this meeting had not happened, it's very, very unlikely that Tibet would be as famous as it is today. It would be kind of like Burmese Buddhist wizards. People in Burma know about this tradition and academics who work on this, but we don't have museums dedicated to Buddhist Burmese wizardry. But we do have museums dedicated to Tibetan art. And I think one of the reasons is, again, this historic meeting. And another element that ties into this, of course, is that we wouldn't have this phenomenal artwork that was produced under the auspices of Tibetan Buddhism and Mongol military power if this relationship hadn't developed. Again, as you can see, and you're not reading that right, but that tanka was just sold for $45 million. And so this artwork is now, of course, highly valued and highly praised, but originally, of course, this was used in tantric rituals in order to, for initiation rites, and also for political legitimacy, and also in doing tantric ritual magic and tantric warfare. So all of this stuff would not have been produced if the imperial courts of Asia were not interested in this. Again, producing this kind of work, this is one of these silk applique tankas, which was produced in the Ming Dynasty at the court of the Yongle Emperor. This would not have been possible if the imperial elite of Asian civilizations were not interested in promoting Tibetan Buddhism. And so again, this is one of the other legacies of this. The fact that we have the Rubin Museum here in Chelsea in New York kind of grows out of this iconic meeting between Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lama. Another important consequence of this meeting is its contemporary geopolitical situations. I mean, again, I know one of the kind of thematic elements of these lectures is, what is the status of Tibet? Should it be independent? Is it a part of China? Is it sovereignty? Should it be autonomous within the PRC and all the rest of it? And in order to understand this, it's also valuable to know how the Chinese think about it. Of course, Westerners might have one interpretation, Tibetans might have another interpretation, and the Chinese, the way that they view it, they see their history or their involvement with Tibet as beginning with the meeting of Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lama. This is the point in time where they say, well, this is when Tibet became a part of China, and so anybody who's talking about Tibetan independence is going against historical precedent. This is when this ritual, economic, political, relationship was established, and we're just continuing the legacy. And as you should follow the, contemporary politics in China, they've very much gotten involved in the kind of the reincarnation recognition game, if you want to call it that, reincarnation politics, of identifying who is the rightful, ruler of Tibetan lineages. And this is following precedent that they found in their historical tradition. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so again, to understand all of these larger geopolitical issues that are going on, it begins with the meeting of Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lama. And the fourth issue that I want to raise, and this is the mandate of this talk today, is that I don't think you can understand kind of early modern Eurasian history without understanding the role of Buddhism in shaping these political relationships, connecting with imperial power, military warfare, and all of the rest of it. Again, I know in the contemporary West, Buddhism has been kind of divorced from all of these things that give religion a bad name, and there's a whole shelf of books kind of explaining the construction, as academics call it, the development of what's called modern Buddhism, and some people go so far as to say that it's the fourth turning of the wheel. There's the three major denominations or groups of Buddhism, the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana, and now we have modern Buddhism, which is a completely different animal in a certain sense, basically because it's adopted Western values and secular humanist ideas, and it's been basically stripped down to mindfulness. But in order to understand the role of Buddhism in Asian history, you have to understand that it was not simply mindfulness. It was connected with economic systems, it was connected with political systems, and it was connected with imperial ideological operations. And so all of the legacy of this production of all this artwork was tied into basically propaganda, saying, I am a Tibetan Buddhist, and confirming this, not only in initiation rites, but also broadcasting to the wider public that I am a devotee of Tibetan Buddhism, and this gives me legitimacy to rule my empire as a Buddhist. And so, again, this is what we'll be looking at over the next few minutes. How did this shape this 400-year period from the 13th century until the 17th century? And in a certain sense, I guess it's the why did the chicken cross the road question. There's obviously many answers to why the chicken crossed the road, and there's probably many answers to why Kublai Khan actually made this decision. As many of you probably know, the Mongol Empire covered huge expanse of territory, and it had a huge number of different religions within its imperial court. And the Mongols were very, very interested in kind of their subjects, but they weren't just interested in kind of their subjects as subjects, but they're also interested in what they could provide as part of the imperial machinery in terms of, technologies, art, crafts, and all of the rest of it. So, Muslims were famous, brought into the Mongol court because they had, very sophisticated siege warfare. And the siege warfare was very helpful for the Mongols when they were trying to conquer Chinese cities, and particularly the southern Song. And so, they're interested in Arab mathematics, Islamic astronomy, and they had interested in Confucianism and Taoism. And this is an old Inner Asian tradition of basically intelligence gathering before you go out on campaigns. You need to know who these people are and what they can offer and give you. And so the Mongols, going all the way back to Genghis Khan, had religious debates at their court. So they would have a Christian, a Muslim, and a Confucian, and basically say, debate, prove which one of you is right. And again, this is it was for amusement, and this was obviously before we had Netflix and all the rest of it, and so it was, a lot of drinking going on, but it was also to figure out what these traditions are and what they could offer. And the short answer, one answer why the Mongols became interested in Tibetan Buddhism is that it was not Chinese. This is a long legacy for northern dynasties, going back to the Northern Wei in the 3rd, 4th century, that they did not want to become part of the Chinese world. I mean, so they did not want to adopt Confucian imperial practices, and so it was basically drawing a line and saying, we're not going to become Chinese. So this was a long-established tradition for almost 1,000 years by the time that Kublai made the decision to align himself with the Tibetans. But more importantly, I think the main reason, or the one that I'm going to be promoting today, and I think it's made very clear in the exhibit up on the 6th floor, is that Tibetan Buddhists had magical power, and particularly this form of what is used in talked about as war magic. And again, this is not necessarily how we think about the Buddhist tradition in the modern West, but this was a deeply ingrained component of the Tantric tradition. That by doing these Tantric ritual practices, becoming enlightened, if that's the proper term, you could transcend the material world and actually transform the world. And so you could cause hailstorms, you can cause floods, you can do all of these things in order to, advance political and military objectives. So in a certain sense, one way to think about Tibetan Buddhism is not, again, mindfulness, but think of it as kind of like a nuclear bomb or nuclear technology or the neutron bomb or in today's warfare, drone warfare. These were the guys who had the technological edge. The Christians, they had nothing to offer. The Confucians had nothing to offer. Muslims, yeah, they had all these sciences of astronomy and mathematics and optics and siege warfare, but they didn't have this magical ability in order to conquer surrounding kingdoms. And in this context, it's important to recognize, again, we think of the Mongol Empire. You can see the map, which stretches from Korea all the way to Hungary. And we kind of assume, well, that's what it was, and that's what it became. But I mean, as with any empire, this does not just happen by default. This took a lot of strategic planning, a lot of access to resources, to horses, to money. You have to pay your soldiers, and all the rest of it. And so, again, to kind of historicize the meeting of Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lama, it's happened in the 1260s. And I don't know if you can see the dates up here, but this was before the Mongols had actually conquered a lot of territory that's now understood as being part of the Mongol Empire. And so, Kublai Khan recognized that if he was going to conquer the southern Song, which was very powerful, it was the economic engine of Asia, as China has always been. They had a lot of resources, they had fortified cities, and how are they going to do this? They're on horses, they're going south, they're dealing with a different climate, it's becoming close to the tropics, and how do they do this? And so for Kublai Khan, he, again, as a military strategist, he said, I want to get these Tibetan Buddhists on my side, and I want them to do war magic when I'm going into war. Excuse me. And, again, we read the historical sources. When, the Mongol armies marched into Vietnam, for example, they had elephants at the head of the charge, and on the lead elephants, they had Tibetan Buddhist masters doing ritual performances in order to, bring down hail or, windstorms or tornadoes or whatever they were doing. And this was understood as this is why, this is how they're going to succeed in defeating Vietnam. Of course, the Mongols did not succeed, and so Tibetan Buddhism maybe oversold itself in this regard. But this was very much in the mind of Kublai Khan when he made this alliance with Pakpa Lama in the 1260s. He still wanted to defeat the southern Song, and again, famously, after being initiated into the Tantric teachings of the Sakya order, he built a temple dedicated to Mahakala, which is basically became the protector saint of the Mongol Empire, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later. But the historical records say that they built this imperial temple, placed the Mahakala statue in it, and faced it south, which of course, facing towards the southern Song. And again, when they did finally defeat the Song in 1279, the Song soldiers, claimed that they had seen, Mahakala up in the sky, and they'd been terrified, and there'd been lightning and all the rest of it. And so again, this confirmed that Kublai Khan had made the right choice, that he had chosen a military and religious political form of warfare that could promote Mongol military success. To get a kind of handle on this idea of Buddhist war magic, again, you probably, if you go to the bookstore up here, you won't find a book of how to do this. You'll find books about how to cook Buddhist vegetarian food and how to do mindfulness and all the rest of it. And it's important to understand that Tantric Buddhism is a very distinctive form of practice and tradition. It arose long after the time of the historical Buddha, more than 1,000 years after. And there's a huge kind of scholarly debate about why it arose, how it arose, where it arose. But we can make some, generalizations about it. And so it arose around the 6th, 7th century in India. And again, this was a particular historical moment in time, as with everything. And I think it's important to recognize that this was a time of social, economic, and political kind of breakdown in India. In India, there's the famous Gupta Dynasty, which is kind of like held up in Indian history as one of the golden age from the 4th to the 7th century. And this was a high point of kind of Hindu political theology. It was kind of developed in the wake of the codification of the famous Hindu epics of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which had kind of reintroduced the idea of Hindu theism and the kind of the Hindu gods that are now widely recognized as, defining the Hindu pantheon. They were codified in the beginning of the first centuries of the Common Era. And they became kind of the political theology of the Gupta Dynasty. And so the Gupta Dynasty adopted this as their political system of thought, and they became incredibly successful, conquered a huge territory of the Indian landmass, and also they expanded widely across, all the way into Southeast Asia. So again, like, why are there Hindu temples in Cambodia or Indonesia? It was at this period of the Gupta Dynasty of a lot of, economic expansion and political relationships across the Bay of Bengal. And, one of the most famous books that some of you may be familiar with from the Gupta Dynasty is the Kama Sutra, which is basically kind of the GQ of the 5th century, telling a man about town how to drink his tea, how to meet women, and of course, how to have sex in various ways. So the Gupta Dynasty was this glorious period of time. And of course, as all empires, it eventually collapsed. And it's within this period of like social, economic, political, meaning of life kind of questioning going on that Tantra arises. And Tantra really built itself on this Hindu idea of Maya, which means illusion. And basically saying all of the things in the world we misunderstand because of our illusion. And in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about this in the idea of conventional reality, and then underlying the conventional reality that we all see on an everyday basis is the ultimate reality. And of course, enlightenment is breaking beyond the bounds of the conventional and realizing ultimate reality. And other Mahayana traditions had various techniques to do this, various meditation practices. But what the Tantrikas decided to do is, they call it the left-hand path. The left hand is, of course, the hand that's used for dirty business. And so they decided that, why do we have these conceptualizations that some things are good, some things are bad? Like, let's say menstrual blood. Why do you say menstrual blood is bad? And so they use this, that's just an illusion. That's just a Maya. So one of the classic tantric initiations is to ingest semen and menstrual blood. Male, female, and the duality of power. And so this is, radically challenging all kinds of idea of Hindu purity laws and caste laws. But again, their whole basic principle was, if you, overcome your conventional obsessions of why is that good, why is that bad, why is that conventionally put that way, you can twist it and you can break your conventional thinking and realize enlightenment. And of course, the most famous, the initial ones use what are the 5 M's. All of the M's start with an M in Sanskrit. And they included alcohol, they included sexual intercourse. And so these are the Tantrikas were using these practices in order to, achieve enlightenment through radical means. And ultimately, the idea became, when you had, realized the ultimate nature of reality, you could bend and you can manipulate it. And so during this period of time, which usually happens at times of kind of economic and political upheaval in world history, there's a rise of witchcraft, sorcery, and all of the rest of it. And so the Tantrikas became famous for being able to manipulate the natural world for their own ends, because they had achieved this, mastery of the underlying nature of reality. And of course, this is the 7th, 8th century, this is a very interesting thing for political leaders. And, again, it's kind of like, always a kind of historical question. This seems like a very obscure, obtuse kind of practice. The initial Tantrikas were doing their ritual practices in graveyards. And it's kind of like, how did these radical antinomian ascetics eventually become at the center of imperial power? And again, the short answer is that they offered power. I mean, as one scholar, he calls the early Tantrikas the Hell's Angels of medieval India. And so again, why did the leaders of ancient India invite these Hell's Angels into their imperial courts? Is again because they offered this radical spiritual power of magical warfare. And most importantly, they offered this idea of the mandala. And the mandala has, of course, now been widely appropriated from everybody from Carl Jung to everybody else. But initially, the mandala meant the imperial space. And of course, when you do visualization practice focused on the mandala, you are the deity in the center of the mandala, and you are building this mandala, around you. And so basically, you are controlling that space. And so by doing that, you become basically the dominant force within that particular mandala. And so this, of course, very easily maps onto imperial power. And so these Tantrikas were invited into all these imperial courts, and what you have here is a map of all of the different dynasties that arose once the Gupta dynasty collapsed. They all wanted this kind of power. They wanted to be able to control their particular territory. And that was, readily identifiable in the mandala. And if you had a tantric master who could use his power to dominate, not only the natural world, but also the people and the subjects in that space, why not? And more importantly, they had this war magic to go so you can conquer your neighbor. And so this is the beginning of this kind of tantric war magic and its appropriation within the political sphere. And as the historical contingencies would have it, it was this form of Buddhism that made its way to Tibet. And so why is Tibetan Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, and its very distinctive artwork and practices and all the rest of it? It was this tradition that was transmitted in Tibet during the imperial period of the 7th to the 9th century. And most famously, one of the figures was Padmasambhava. Of course, now we know that the legend of Padmasambhava is completely fabricated. It was a later kind of Buddhist mythography in justifying the conversion of Tibet. But that's another issue. But the story has it that Padmasambhava was a tantric master from Udayana, which is now the Swat Valley in Pakistan. He was invited to Tibet in order to introduce the Dharma. And most famously, what he did is that he dominated the landscape of Tibet. And particularly, he converted all of the local spirits, the mountain spirits, the river spirits, into Dharma protectors. So he was able to do this through his tantric magical powers. And he, of course, along with this tantric teachings, he brought with him the idea of the mandala. And so what you have here is Samye Monastery, the first monastery built in Tibet, which, as you can see, is laid out as a mandala. And so this political, religious idea, was very enticing to the Tibetan rulers. They had their own kind of imperial ideology, but that imperial ideology did not necessarily translate to the peoples outside of the Tibetan plateau. And so they recognized they needed a kind of an international religion that people in the Tang Dynasty China or the Uyghurs or people on the Silk Road would recognize, and Buddhism was it. And so the story that Padmasambhava that kind of encapsulates this idea of power and control and domination is well encapsulated in the famous story of the demoness. So when Songtsen Gampo, the Tibetan emperor, was rising up militarily, he was threatening the Tang Dynasty, and the Tang emperor basically wanted to buy him off and say, don't invade Chang'an, the imperial capital. You stay up on the Tibetan plateau, and we'll have friendly relations. He offered up his daughter and married the daughter off to Songtsen Gampo. And when this Chinese princess came to Lhasa, she said, why is Buddhism not establishing, or why are things not going the way they are? And she, using feng shui, read the landscape and realized that Tibet itself was a demon, or demoness, and it needed to be suppressed and nailed down. And so Padmasambhava famously nailed down the demoness by building Buddhist monasteries all over the landscape of Tibet, and most famously the Johan temple, which is the most iconic, important temple in Lhasa, is on her heart. And so again, this is a mythological story, but it very well captures these dynamics of Buddhism, political power, and control and domination. And of course, this became the ideology that undergirded the Tibetan Empire. Of course, the Tibetan Empire, I don't know what role this kind of magical power played in the conquest, but it was definitely a fundamental part of the ideological construction of what the Tibetans were doing. Obviously building an empire that conquered all of Central Asia, conquered the Silk Road, conquered Chang'an and conquered the Tang Dynasty. They obviously had a lot of other things going for them: military strategy, marriage alliances, horses. But undergirding it was the ideological argument, or ideological understanding, that the Tibetan emperor was the Buddha Vajrayana, one of the Tantric, one of the 5 Tantric Buddhist deities, and he was a manifestation of this. And so the Tibetan Empire, him at the center, projected out the mandala and created the Tibetan imperial space. Yet, as happens with every imperial entity, it eventually collapsed. And Tibet, as Tibet has historically been wont to be, it invariably descended into civil war. Tibetan history is basically 1,000 years of civil war. Various aristocratic clans aligning themselves with particular tantric masters and claiming this is my territory, and fighting those people over there who had their own tantric master, doing their own ritual practices and claiming that's my territory. And so that's been pretty much the history of Tibet for at least 1,000 years. And it was certainly the case with the fall of the imperial house. In Tibetan historiography, this is called the Dark Ages. We don't know, but it's about a 100-year period where we know very, very little what was going on in Tibet. But we do know that more Buddhist teachings were coming in from India. This was the beginning of Islamic movement into North India, and there was kind of a fleeing of Muslim possible persecution. And so new tantric masters with new ritual practices, new magical warfare were coming in, and the Tibetans were like, we want what you have. We want to use it in order to control our power. And it wasn't only them that were interested in this. It was also this small kingdom there that you see, the Shisha kingdom. And the Shisha was a kingdom that was ruled by a people called the Tanguts, and the Tanguts were linguistically and ethnically related to the Tibetans. They had very strong connections. And the Shisha kingdom basically took over the kind of imperial ideology that the Tibetan Empire had left in their area, which is the area, the Gansu corridor, that was basically the eastern terminus of the Silk Road. Very important, economic node. But they adopted this imperial ideology, Tibetan tantric warfare, and this is very much part of their world. And in Tibet itself, one of the most important figures that arose in this period of time in the 11th, 12th century was this guy called Lama Zhang. And what he was famous for was creating a whole new corpus of ritual magic texts that could be used for warfare. And in particular, he became a master, or promoted the worship of Mahakala, in particular the one that I mentioned earlier that became kind of the patron saint of the Mongol Empire. And most importantly, one of Lama Zhang's students who he had studied with, took these teachings and brought it to the Tangut court. And the Tanguts were like, this is great, this is a new military strategy or new magical warfare that we can use to shore up our position. I mean, as you kind of see, they were kind of squished between the Karakitai out in Central Asia, the Jin Dynasty in northern China, and the Song in southern China. And so they needed all of their kind of military and strategical assets that they could muster. And so this Mahakala tradition was the one that they adopted and basically made Mahakala kind of, again, the patron saint of the Shisha kingdom. And again, none of this was happening in a vacuum, of course. At the same time as this was going on, as you can see on the Mongolian plateau, this was the beginning of the rise of the Mongols. The Mongols had fractured and broken apart in various ways. And of course, as you all know, eventually they were unified under the military authority of Chinggis Khan, and who was elevated to the supreme ruler of the Mongolian people in 1206. When that happened, he had a long list of grievances against his neighboring peoples. Like the Jin Dynasty had killed his father, so he wanted to go conquer the Jin. The Tanguts, they had done other things and they needed to be conquered. And so this is the beginning of Mongol expansion. And the first people that, or one of the first groups that Chinggis Khan did attack were the Tanguts. He wanted to, again, this is not just, because they killed his father. This was obviously economic. You needed to control the Silk Road in order to build a dynasty. You needed to have access to resources. And so Chinggis Khan invaded Shisha, and it failed spectacularly. This is what you see here is the old imperial capital, Harhat, the Black City, which was the imperial center of the Tangut kingdom. And as you can see, there's a river that runs by it. And Mongol military strategy was to build huge dams and basically, create an artificial lake and then blow the dam and just flood out the city. It was kind of like water warfare in a certain sense. And stories have it that, the Mongols built this thing up and, the Tanguts were terrified. And what did they do? They, of course, did the ritual practices of Mahakala in order to defeat the Mongols. And they succeeded. The dam broke, the Mongol armies were, flushed out, their horses died, and, and Chinggis Khan had to go back to the Mongol steppe by having lost. And of course, the Mongols, as I mentioned, they were very systematically interested in, obtaining knowledge about all of their people around them, gathering intelligence about, what can these people, what can they offer us technologically, economically, politically, et cetera, et cetera. And so when they figured out that the Tanguts had defeated Chinggis Khan by resorting to tantric practices of Mahakala, of course, this is the beginning of the kind of the Mongol identification with Mahakala as the most important deity of the dynasty. And to give you a sense of how important this deity still is today, I mean, I was in Mongolia many years ago now, but I was talking to a leading Mongol scholar about what happened to the famous Mahakala. I mean, there was a famous statue that was built by Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lama, and it was kind of like, the symbol of the dynasty. And it's been lost. I mean, so the one that you see in the exhibit here is a later reproduction. And so his interpretation was, well, and again, to explain contemporary Chinese geopolitics, of course, in the 20th century, Chinese geopolitics was the civil war between the nationalists and the communists. And he claimed that the reason that the nationalists lost is because they lost the Mahakala statue. In particular, in his interpretation was when they were fleeing to Taiwan, they packed everything up from the imperial capital, which is now the basis of the Palace Museum in Taipei. They took the Mahakala statue, and there was a storm when they were sailing off to Taiwan, and they lost the Mahakala statue. And so the nationalists can never reclaim, according to his interpretation, because they lost the Mahakala statue, which is the imperial center of Chinese religious history. Take that for what you want, but this statue and this tradition is taken very seriously. So the short answer to that question that I began with is that Kublai Khan was simply following the Tangut model. It wasn't a new revelation or a new tradition. All of the components of being initiated into the Hevajra Tantra, initiated into the Mahakala Tantra, recognizing Pakpa Lama as the imperial preceptor, this was all based on Tangut precedent. And again, the whole idea that the Mongols wanted to use this in order to justify, or use it as a vehicle of conquering further territory, which they did. They conquered the Song in 1279. They went into Burma, and as I said, they failed in Vietnam. But nevertheless, this was part of who they thought they were and justified their success. And it wasn't only Kublai who did this. It was also Hulagu. Hulagu is Kublai Khan's brother, who was sent off to conquer the Middle East. And he did. He famously sacked Baghdad in 1258 and famously killed the caliph and basically brought to the end the Abbasid Caliphate, and then established Mongol rule in the area that's now Iran and Iraq. And it was called the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate was Buddhist. I mean, again, this is probably very little known, and Muslim historians don't like to talk about it because it's kind of mortifying to think that, the heartland of the Muslim world was ruled by a Tibetan Buddhist dynasty for 50 years, but it was from the middle of the 13th century to the end of the, basically 1300. And this had huge consequences, but again, why did they do this? Why rule a Muslim territory using Tibetan Buddhist ideological apparatus? Because it was the same thing with Kublai. This is what you did. This is what how you maintained your dynasty. And this had many curious consequences. This generated a lot of surprising back and forth between Buddhist and Muslim worlds. As you can see here, some of this kind of artistic interaction. On one side, you have the feet of Rangchung Dorje, the Karmapa Lama, and on the other side, the footprint or feet of Ali. And so there was some kind of artistic exchange, and the most famous, consequence of this was the development of the portraiture of Muhammad. I mean, again, nowadays everybody talks about you can't represent Muhammad, but during the Ilkhanate period, the Buddhist tradition is awash with iconographic representation, and Muslims adopted this tradition in order to promote their own theological arguments with the Mongols. And this continued for several centuries as a result of this Muslim-Buddhist interaction in the Ilkhanate. We're talking about consequences or influences of this iconic meeting. And it went even further than that. Sufi masters, of course, were talking with Tibetan Buddhist masters, and they realized they believed in reincarnation. And reincarnation was, of course, a big thing in Platonic thought, which has greatly influenced Islamic sciences, and they started adopting this themselves, and they started, arguing that the Mongols were, even though that they were barbarians and weren't connected with Muhammad by bloodlines, they could be reincarnations of Muhammad. And in particular, they made the argument that the Mongols were reincarnations of Ali, and this was in the Shia tradition, which of course had huge consequences for the subsequent early modern world of Islam. So this iconic meeting, priest-patron relationship, had wide-ranging consequences across Eurasia, and this is one of them. But again, all dynasties fall apart, and it was no different with the Mongols. And when this happened, all of these dynasties had to deal with the legacy of the Mongol Empire. Scholarship calls this the Chinggisid legacy. Basically, every one of these dynasties that came after the Mongol Empire, they had to deal and basically justify that they were legitimate in the Chinggisid mold. And the main way that you did this was through blood. But of course, only the Mongols themselves had Chinggisid blood. So all of these other dynasties, including the Russians, Ivan the Terrible, he adopted the title Khan. The Ottomans did this, the Moguls did this in India. They all tried to do all of these elaborate kind of historiographical and ritual practices in order to prove that they were the rightful heirs of the Mongol heritage. And most importantly, and what I want to be looking at, is the Ming Dynasty and the Mongols and the Oirat. They were the kind of the three dynasties or imperial entities that ruled in Inner Asia and China in the wake of the Mongol collapse in 1368. And all of them, again, needed to prove that they were Chinggisid. The Mongols they can say, well, we're the descendants, we have the rightful claim to reclaim the Mongol Empire. And they had a lot of power, and this mortified the Chinese, the Han Dynasty. And of course, the Ming was kind of in traditional historiography, is kind of a reclaiming of the Chinese heritage. They kicked out the barbarian Mongols, and they're going to revive the righteous, Chinese or Han Chinese cultural values. But again, scholars have gone back and kind of reevaluated basically the first 100 years of the Ming Dynasty. And they spent an enormous amount of time and resources basically telling everybody, from the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Vietnamese. They wrote letters saying, we are the rightful heirs of Genghis Khan and all the rest of it. But of course, they couldn't claim that they had Chinggisid blood, which was always a big problem. So they basically adopted Tibetan Buddhism and said, well, the Mongols were Tibetan Buddhists, we are the same. And so the Yongle Emperor in particular really kind of made this a huge component of his imperial ideology and promoted it, again, with the Koreans, with the Vietnamese, with the Japanese, saying, we are the rightful heirs of Kublai and Pakpa Lama because we do the same thing. And so this is a portrait of the Yongle Emperor you see in the smaller figure on the right in the yellow robe, which is the imperial color of the Ming, and the Karmapa Lama. And so basically recreating the Kublai Pakpa thing in order to promote his Chinggisid legitimacy. And again, why do this? Again, it's imperial ideology, propaganda, and all the rest of it. But it's again also tied into the question of magical warfare and power. The Ming court was very, very involved with the worship of Mahakala, and this is again a portrait you can see up on the 6th floor, which is kind of again based on the statue that was from the Yuan Dynasty, but they wanted to use this in their own battles of projecting their own power, and most importantly, who did they want to defeat? Who was their great mortal enemy? Was of course the Mongols themselves. I mean, again, the Mongols were pushed out of Beijing in 1368, and they moved back to the Mongolian steppe, but they still were a powerful military political force, and particularly politically, they could claim that they were the heirs of Chinggis. They could write a letter to the Korean emperor or king of Korea and say, send your troops so we can attack the Ming and revive the Mongol Empire. And the Korean king would. This was the kind of system that they worked in. The Chinggisid legacy had a lot of power. And so this terrified the Ming. I mean, again, they spent enormous amounts of resources in order to try to defeat the Ming. On this map is the campaigns that the Yongle Emperor did against the Mongols in the beginning of the 15th century to kind of get rid of this legitimate threat to his political legitimacy. But they failed spectacularly, all of these campaigns, even with the power of Mahakala behind them. And so in a certain sense, the Ming was kind of at their wits' end, so to speak. And so how are we going to defeat the Mongols who do have legitimate claims to the Beijing throne? How do we eliminate them as a threat to our authority? So they decided that they were going to ally themselves with the Oirat. As you can see on the map here, are a people who controlled the steppe north of the Mongols. And the Oirat, they were related to the Mongols, ethnically, linguistically, or whatever, but they were not part of the Chinggisid line. I mean, in Western scholarship, they're called the Western Mongols. So they could not claim to be Chinggisid, but they could still, try to, much like the Ming could. And so what the Ming decided to do in order to defeat the Mongols is they used the horse trade. This is a huge component of Chinese history. China, for environmental reasons, does not have soil that contains selenium. Selenium is a nutrient that's needed to grow the grass in order to raise powerful horses. And so for all of history, China has always had to rely on the steppe people, the Xiongnu, the Turks, the Mongols, whoever, in order to give them cavalry warfare, horses for transport and all the rest of it. So this has always been kind of a strategic problem for the Chinese court, how to get horses from these people without, losing the war, so to speak. And so what the Ming decided to do, they said, instead of buying horses from the Moguls in Central Asia or the Mongols, we're going to open up a big trade with the Oirat. And they did. So all of their horse trade went through the Oirats. And of course, when they had this economic power and the political connections with the Ming imperial court, the Oirat became incredibly powerful. And they basically started dominating and decimating the Mongols themselves. And basically, they started saying, we are the rightful heirs of the Chinggisid legitimacy. And this kind of backfired for the Ming kind of spectacularly. The Oirat became so powerful that they eventually defeated the Ming. The Ming, there's the famous battle is called the Tumu incident, which is the city where it occurred. And what happened is that the Oirat ruler, using all his economic, political, Chinggisid legitimacy, he went to this city and captured the Ming emperor, which was, of course, a fiasco for Ming imperial claims to legitimacy. So this basically turned the tables on the Ming, and they were like, what are we going to do now? And scholars who study 15th century China, this was basically the turning point in Chinese history. Again, many people don't know about the Tumu incident, but basically it's one of the most important military defeats in world history. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, famously, that after this loss, the Ming turned inwards, right? This is when they started building the Great Wall in kind of this xenophobic trade barrier. They famously, before that, they'd been sending off, Zheng He and these expeditions to go to Africa and basically, a global power. But after 1449, the Ming stopped, right? And so people who do world history, the great question is, why did, the West rise and China collapse? It was basically the Tumu incident, right? China turned inwards at the critical moment in time that Europe was rising, and of course China went down. And now China's coming back, but it took, more than 500 years. But so this was all revolving around, Tibetan Buddhism, the Chinggisid legacy, and who was the rightful ruler of Inner Asia. And it's within this, basically, when the Ming turns inwards, the Oirat, their economic resource base that they had built up, collapses. And this opens up the door for the Mongols, who had been squeezed, in like anvil between, the Oirat and the Ming, to revive. And the most important Mongol who headed the charge, or the revival of Mongol power, was Altan Khan. And Altan Khan, again, much like the Ming and the Oirat themselves, he could not claim Chinggisid legitimacy. In the Chinggisid, logic, you had to be, it's in primogeniture. You had to father to son, first son. He was the third son. So he was he could not claim the Mongol throne. And so, but he did conquer all of Inner Mongolia and Mongolia and defeated the Oirats. And so he, without a doubt, had the most political power on the steppe. But so how does he prove his Chinggisid legitimacy, or overturn turn the tables on his older brother and say that I'm the rightful heir? He said, I'm going to make an alliance with the Tibetan Lamas. And in particular, who he met was the new young leader of the youngest tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, the Gelugpa order, which of course is the tradition of the Dalai Lama. And so when they met in 1572, Altan Khan gave Sonam Gyatso the title Dalai Lama. So that's where that title comes from. Dalai is a Mongol word which means ocean. So he's the Lama with oceanic wisdom is the kind of standard interpretation. But again, when he did this, he had to deal with the Chinggisid legacy. He was not the rightful heir, and the Dalai Lama was certainly not the rightful, Mongol Lama, because he was not of the Sakya order. He was not of the same lineage as Pakpa Lama. And so what they adopted in order to circumvent this problem is that they adopted, they used the Tibetan theory of reincarnation, which had become a big thing in the Tibetan world, beginning with the Karmapa Lama, who initiated this idea that when he dies, he can decide where he's going to be reborn, and he would write a letter saying where he's going to be reborn. And so now we have the 17th Karmapa, and we have the 14th Dalai Lama. And so this tradition of reincarnation They adopted this in order to justify this kind of basically bald usurpation of power. They basically said, well, I'm not the rightful heir, but I'm actually the reincarnation of Kublai Khan. And Sonam Gyatso, or the third Dalai Lama as he became known, is not really a righteous ruler either, or religious master, but he's actually an incarnation of Pakpa Lama. So again, this iconic meeting was used to justify their illegal, basically, according to Chinggisid policy, usurpation of power. Of course, this, once the kind of the Pandora's box of reincarnation was opened, basically anybody can say I'm an incarnation of anybody. I can say I'm the incarnation of Kublai Khan. How am I going to disprove that? How's anyone going to argue with that? I mean, again, in this world, what proves that that is legitimate is that you're successful militarily and you defeat your enemies. But once this reincarnation argument was out of the bag, so to speak, it basically fostered a massive civil war across the whole Tibetan Mongolian world, where every kind of local potentate would say, I'm the heir of Kublai Khan, and whatever Lama that they could find, a Nyingma Lama, Kagyu Lama, Gelugpa Lama, Sakya Lama, would give them the blessing, and they would say, let's create the mandala of our political space. And so basically, from the end of the 16th century into the 17th century, this whole Tibetan plateau, across the Mongolian plateau, was one bloody Mongol civil war, or Buddhist civil war. Everybody using war magic. Again, if you go up to the museum on the 6th floor, there's a wonderful Mongol helmet with all of these mantras around it, which kind of like encapsulates the world that this was operating in. You wore this helmet, with Buddhist magic mantras on it in order to defeat your enemies, be they Tibetan or a different Buddhist order or whatever they might be. And so this was, again, a time of political upheaval, religious upheaval, but it was also a time of economic upheaval, because the Ming Dynasty, the engine of Asian economy, was collapsing at this period of time. And with the collapse of the Ming and the civil war happening across Inner Asia, another power rose to take the mantle, and that was the Manchus. And the Manchus are, again, a non-Chinese or non-Han Chinese people who came from what is now known as Manchuria, northeast China. And eventually, they conquered the Ming in 1644 and ruled China until 1911. And they too, much like the Russians, much like the Ottomans, much like the Moguls in India, they all had to deal with the Chinggisid legacy. And of course, they were not Mongol by blood. So what did they do? They played with all of these, imperial metaphors and emblems of Chinggisid authority. And particularly, they found the Mahakala statue, where they were given it by the Mongols. The Mongols eventually allied themselves with the Manchus and said, we'll join your military machine to conquer China. And so here's the Mahakala statue, and they also gave them the Mongol imperial seal, which is, in the Asian world is a huge, symbol of political power. And so, the Manchus, who had no right to claim, to rule anything, they were a bunch of fishermen, from up in the hinterland, but they got these symbols of political legitimacy from the Mongol Empire and basically started their campaign of saying, we are the righteous heirs of Genghis Khan, and we can therefore conquer China, we can conquer Central Asia, and we can conquer Tibet, which of course they did subsequently. But again, they reenacted the symbolism of the Kublai Pakpa meeting, most famously the Shunja Emperor, who was the emperor who was ruling when they conquered Beijing. He invited the 5th Dalai Lama to come to Beijing, which he did. And again, they had this meeting of the minds, basically recreating the Yuan Dynasty meeting and basically saying that the Manchus are the rightful heirs of the Yuan legacy. Of course, as you've probably gotten a sense now, they weren't the only ones. And what happened at this period of time, much as it happened after the fall of the Yuan itself, was there was a 4-way civil war between 4 Buddhist kingdoms, all of them recreating themselves on the logic of the priest-patron relationship. You had the Qing in China itself. Up north of them, you had the Halk Mongols. To the west, you had the Dzungars. The Dzungar, the term means left hand, and basically they were the Oirats. When the Oirats were defeated by the Mongols, they were pushed like billiard ball fashion out to the area that's now northwest China or Xinjiang province. And And then you had, of course, Tibet itself. And all four of them, so you have in Beijing, you have the Manchus claiming that they are the rightful heirs of the Yuan Dynasty and rightful Gelugpa Buddhists. In Mongolia, you have the Tushet Khan creating alliance with Jetsundanpa Hutuktu, which is, becomes the Dalai Lama of Mongolia, recreating this ritual relationship. In Tibet itself, you have the fifth Dalai Lama, who creates a ritual relationship with the Hushot Mongol leader Gushri Khan, who, using Mongol military power, basically decimates all of the other Tibetan Buddhist orders, the Sakya, the Nyingma, and the Kagyu, and all of their aristocratic allies, basically slaughters them all and gives Tibet to the Dalai Lama. And in return, the Dalai Lama recognizing Gushri Khan as the king of Tibet. So again, this is its own mandala geopolitical space that's part of this global or East Asian civil war. And the fourth and final one is Galdan Khan, who's the ruler of the Dzungars. He has, a ritual relationship with the fifth Dalai Lama, and, again, reclaiming that he is the rightful ruler of this mandala, this territorial space of northwest China, and, justified it by, he recreated the Kublai Pakpa relationship, and so this is their rightful territory. And so in a certain sense, you could imagine that there could have been four Gelugpa kingdoms getting along and, having a good time, but invariably, when tantric war magic is involved, that doesn't happen to be the case. And most importantly, what happened is that the Dalai Lama saw that things were spinning out of control, and he sent a peace envoy to the Mongols and basically said, let's talk about, settling our squabbles. And during this meeting, the Jetsundanpa Hutuktu sat on a throne higher than the Dalai Lama's envoy, which of course in this kind of world is a status marker. And the Dzungars, who were kind of Gelugpa fundamentalists, took this as a gross affront to the righteous authority and power of the Dalai Lama, and subsequently invaded Halk Mongolia and burned all the monasteries, killed everybody, carried off the women and children and all the rest of it. And of course the Halka were like, what are we going to do? They allied themselves with the Qing. And so this is why Mongolia became a part of the Qing dynasty. In 1696, they allied with the Qing and say, we're going to defeat our arch enemies, the Dzungars. And of course, that's what the Qing did with the help of Mongol military power. In 1757, they basically ethnically cleansed, as we would call it in today's world, the Dzungars. They don't exist anymore because they were a thorn in the side for 100 years of the Qing, and they had to go, and they did go. Of course, at the same time, the Qing also conquered Tibet. The power of the Dalai Lama was weakened, and all of this became incorporated in the Buddhist Qing, right? And the way that this was reconceptualized, basically they got rid of the priest-patron relationship and recreated themselves as the ruler, the sole ruler of the whole Buddhist empire as manifestations of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And so not only that, by jettisoning the old imperial, the Kublai Pakpa Lama model, they also made themselves the arbiters of who could be reincarnated. Again, they were always terrified that the Tibetans would rise up again, or the Dzungars would rise up again, or the Mongols would rise up again. And so they took the authority of recognizing who could be reincarnated. So in Mongolia, the Jetsundanpa Hutuktu, who was the Mongol Dalai Lama, he could no longer be Mongol because they were always terrified that a Mongol Lama and a Mongol aristocrat could revive the Chinggisid legacy and attack the Qing. So they mandated that the Jetsundanpa Hutuktu had to be Mongolian. And so basically broke that kind of tradition. And it's the same with Tibet. The Qing court introduced the golden urn ritual, which is a ritual where instead of, the Tibetans had their own tradition of recognizing reincarnations, but in the golden urn ritual, you write the name on wooden sticks, put it in the golden urn, and whichever one is pulled out is the one that is used. It's the one who's recognized as the reincarnation. So basically took the authority away from the Tibetans themselves and put it in the hands of the Beijing court. And of course, this is the legacy that we live with today, right? You know, everybody talks about Tibet, and now, as you may know, the Communist Party has revived the golden urn ritual. I mean, some of you may have heard of what happened with the Panchen Lama, who's the number 2 Lama in the Gelugpa order. The Dalai Lama recognized one child, and the Communist Party recognized another child. And of course, this is all about winning the hearts and minds of the Tibetans, but what happened with the Panchen Lama recognized by the Dalai Lama is that he disappeared. Him and his family have never been seen again. And now the Communist Party recognized Dalai Lama, lives in Beijing, and again is the great hope that, you know, that he will become the new representative of the Tibetans and bring them into the bosom of the motherland as they like to imagine it. And of course, the ultimate goal of all of this reincarnation politics is who's going to recognize the next Dalai Lama, right? The Communist Party is laying the groundwork to say that they have the religious authority citing the Qing in order to recognize who the Dalai Lama should be. So in a sense, the meeting of Kublai and Pakpa in 1360s was a long time ago, but it still has important resonances still today. So I guess I'll end with the, you know, proverbial wisdom: history matters. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, we have plenty of time. More than happy to answer any of them.
Yes.
Hopefully, if I can't guarantee that.
Tara, will you pass the mic to the gentleman in the front here?
I'd like to learn a little bit more about the Fifth Dalai Lama. That he went and met with all 4 of these different nations. That's an amazing story, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, in a certain sense, I mean, it's like, you know, the way I was presenting it, it's like legitimating the secular ruler in a certain sense. You know, much in the same way as you kind of see, like, you know, I mean, again, you can draw parallels with any other religious tradition. It's like, you know, the caliph and the ulama, the Muslim community, or Caesaro-papism in the Orthodox world, or, you know, the Pope recognizing different European rulers and divine right. I mean, it's a two-way street. It's, you know, yes, it gives the authority to the political leader, but it also gives power to the Dalai Lama. It recognizes gives him, you know, legitimacy within the Tibetan world. And so again, like I was talking about in this, you know, during the rise of the 5th Dalai Lama, Tibet was completely fractured, right? There were different, you know, ruling families who were connected with different monastic or different tantric masters. Most importantly, there was the Rinpoche family, which ruled central Tibet. And they were allied with the Karmakagyu, so their Lama of choice was the Karmapa. And they were, you know, they were the power. The Dalai Lama and the Gelugpa order were kind of like the young upstarts. They'd only been founded, you know, in the wake of the Mongol Empire in the 15th century by Tsongkhapa. And basically, no Tibetan aristocrats had allied with them because, you know, they were like the young upstarts. You know, they've had long relations with the Karmapa, long relationships with the Nyingma, long relations with the Sakya, so why choose this new order? I mean, so again, so the meeting with the 3rd Dalai Lama and Altan Khan was kind of like the Gelugpa recognizing, if we can get Mongol military power on our side, you know, it'll give us, you know, military power to wipe out our, you know, the Rinpoche family and all the rest of them. And so the 5th Dalai Lama, you know, is following up on this. The Gelugpa is still a fledgling order in dealing with the civil war. He needs Mongol military power, and that's why he allies with Gushri Khan, and Gushri Khan comes in and wipes everybody out and puts the Dalai Lama on the throne. But at the same time, the Dalai Lama, you know, has to prove his credentials to the Tibetans. And by going to Beijing and saying, look, I recognize the Manchu emperor. Look, I recognize the Tushet Han in Mongolia. Look, I, you know, ritually, you know, initiated the Dzungars. So not only am I the rightful ruler of Tibet, internationally, you know, if you use that term in this context, I am the recognized arbiter of Buddhist authority, not the Karmapa, not the Jonangpa, or whoever. And so it kind of works on both ways like that. And then, of course, you know, the big, you know, dynamic shift that happens with the 5th Dalai Lama, particularly after he dies, is the kind of institutionalization of the Dalai Lama as a theocracy, which is the radical change. I mean, Buddhist history has always been that there's a secular authority and a religious authority. so Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lama and whatever. And what happens with the Dalai Lama, and particularly, during in the writings of his regent, is that this collapses, right? So now we talk about the Dalai Lama as being, the religious political head of Tibet. That's a complete anomaly in Buddhist history. That's never happened anywhere. I mean, it's a theocracy. And again, this kind of debate, like where he got the idea to do this, and I've made the argument that they got it from the Muslim world, which was happening in Sufi-Inner Asia. They had promoted this idea of a theocracy, that the ruler is also, the Sufi master. And so this kind of collapsed these two ideas. And so, once Gushri Khan and his family, were kind of pushed out of the picture, the Dalai Lama, the fifth Dalai Lama, basically elevated himself, unifying religion and politics, and he didn't need the Mongols anymore. They had done their business. They'd killed all the enemies. So hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
The next question. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Elverskog. That was an incredible synthesis of centuries of history and thought. So I'm just very impressed. There's one piece of the puzzle that I was hoping perhaps we could weave in here too. You present Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan intellectual traditions as revolving around war magic and Mahakala, and that, as you presented and as upstairs represents, is undoubtedly the case. But I was wondering if you could also speak to scholasticism. So the reason I bring that up is, for example, the Tibetan canons are being, first of all, solidified in the 14th century and being reproduced under the patronage of these various figures that you're speaking to. So I was wondering, other than the canons or even including the canons, where does scholasticism come into play in addition to these war magic rituals?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a huge question, obviously. Again, in this kind of like, this presentation, of course, I'm, playing the war magic card, but that's only one slice of the pie, obviously. As you rightfully point out, there was a lot of other things going on and developing in the intellectual tradition. But and I think, but the canons, and the creation of the conjure, and much as the printing of the conjure, which was happening at this time, and particularly in the Ming court. This was also, a long-established tradition of political legitimacy, right? So the Song Dynasty did it, the Tonguts did it, the Jurchens did it, and most famously the Koreans, which is the famous, printed canon in Korea. This was one of the kind of emblems of a Buddhist political power, that you created the canon. And there's underlying logic of merit of doing that. This is, what more merit can you produce than, sanctify or printing the word of the Buddha. So there's this kind of Buddhist logic behind it. But it's also tied into this political, like I can do this. I had the wherewithal and the political resources in order to do this, which is enormous, to carve the 108-volume conjure and print it and then distribute it around the empire. But so again, I'm sidestepping your question of scholasticism. But tied into that, all of this apparatus that's going on is all of this translation. So like the translating Chinese sources into Tibetan, Tibetan sources into Chinese for the first time. So there's a lot of kind of intellectual ferment that's going on at the same time, which I think this, when you've taken the mantle that you're a Buddhist kingdom, this enables this kind of scholasticism to arise. And it definitely exploded at this period of time. But I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully somewhat.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you very much. My question is in some ways related to the first one. I'm interested in knowing more about what was the actual nature of Mongol rule of Tibet after the founding of the Ganden-Potran. Like, although the Dalai Lama appointed or gave the title of king to Gurshi Khan, was he like, what was his actual like role and relationship to the Dalai Lama or to the desis?
Yeah.
Thank you.
They, with the Hashot Mongols, the Ganden-Potran maintained ritual relationships throughout that time. The title King of Tibet was inherited by Gushri Khan's son, I think for a few generations. I mean, at least to the beginning of the 1700s. I mean, so this kind of idea was there in the background that they still had this mantle, but in many ways, the Hashot Mongols were pushed back. I guess now we'd call Qinghai or Amdo, and they really didn't have that much power within central Tibet, and that was basically the domain of the Dalai Lama. I mean, so it was kind of there as a fictional narrative in the background, but with the Dalai Lama kind of like consolidating power in the 1640s and 50s, and then definitely during the reign of Deshi, who kind of like rewrote the whole understanding of what the Dalai Lama institution was. I mean, it was still there, and they could sometimes access it and use it for military, like to challenge if one of the other orders was challenging Gelugpa dominance, they could still resort on the Hashot Mongols to come in and defeat their enemies. But I think, after the Deshi's writings, which really kind of, created the theocracy, you don't need the Hashot Mongols. I mean, yes, they're good to have as a military ally, but you don't have this ritual relationship, the Hublai, Pakpa relationship. And so that really downplayed. And on the flip side of this, of course, is that the Hashot Mongols didn't like that, right? I mean, and so this is where all these kind of conflicts arose in the beginning of the 18th century, that the Hashot Mongols were basically reclaiming like their what they thought was theirs. And of course, this is the beginning of Qing involvement in the Sino-Tibetan borderlands. Like, the rebellion happens, and they're like, what are these people doing? And so that's when the Qing starts going in to quell this disturbance. But in the background of this is that the fifth Dalai Lama and Deshi in particular had changed the relationship with the Hashot Mongols, and they felt shortchanged in a certain sense.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. So I have a much more specific question now. My question is about sources. So you had some really excellent maps that were showing the shifts of power over time. And I was wondering specifically about those maps. Where do those come from? Did you make those yourself, or did you pull them from specific books? And also perhaps more generally, where we as interested audience members might be able to look to learn more about these relationships over time.
Well, the maps come from my own book. I mean, Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road, kind of explaining these geopolitical shifts, and where to look. At this kind of stuff. I think for this period of time, I mean, like you talk about sources. One of the things is that this is it's a difficult period to do with sources. I mean, there's basically no Mongol sources. I mean, and the Chinese sources are, of course, incredibly biased, and the Tibetan sources are being written a little bit later. But the classic sources, my teachers, Elliot Sperling's, his dissertation on Ming-Mongol relations. There's now, I think there's a lot of new scholarships coming out on, and particularly the Ming is the kind of the key in this, because again, in traditional Chinese historiography, is that the Ming is like the return to Han, the great Han culture and civilization, and they don't have to deal with these barbarians. But now, over the last 10 years, a lot of scholars have kind of like reevaluated this, looking at, again, the Chinggisid legacy and their connections with the Tibetan Buddhism. And so scholars like Carl Debreceni, who's senior curator here, David Robinson, who's at Colgate, has written, I call it the New Qing history. He's done a series of edited volumes published by Harvard, looking at the kind of this dynamic. And he has a new book coming out in a couple of months that really kind of really explores in enormous detail how much the Ming court was dealing with these the frontiers and dealing with the Chinggisid legacy and the Tibetan Buddhist legacy. So those are two scholars I would look at.